So there are many areas where I agree with Carl in his recent video about why Nick Fuentes is so popular at the moment, and in particular why he's gaining popularity at the expense of the intellectual dark web old guard like Jordan Peterson, Dave Rubin, Ben Shapiro, Brett Weinstein, Sam Harris, and so on. For one, Fuentes is right to call out the historical failure of the Republican Party to really come to terms with the racialised political situation in the US. I think Europe suffers from something of a similar kind with its politicians. This is especially true regarding the political games that the Democratic Party have been playing over the immigration issue and the significant changes that have happened as a result in the fabric of American culture, society and its politics. Fuentes is also right to assert the fact that the political establishment in America has ignored these issues at home while seemingly managing to move mountains to satisfy the demands of some extremely powerful lobby groups of various kinds. The thesis that America is no longer for Americans or governed for Americans to a considerable degree does stand up. Like, America is run by a corporate oligarchy and has been for some time. That's not a conspiracy theory as far as I'm concerned. That's the political incarnation of what you get when corporations grow monolithically large and are allowed to pursue interests beyond the borders of the nations within which they operate. They have so much purchasing power that it's not difficult to find politicians in the system and across the world who are willing to sell their political agency to the highest bidder. This is one of the legitimate functional problems with liberal democracies. People can just be bought, and that does have a politically transformative effect. This is why the constant defences that you still hear from classical liberals and libertarians in favour of small statism, free markets, the continued uttering of buzz phrases that you commonly hear within the Chicago and Austrian schools of economics. This to me has always come across as a big LARP. Like, I've never understood this performative enthusiasm that so many traditional Republican Americans have for situating their own freedom in the right for corporate America and Wall Street to get infinitely richer while their own lives continue to gravitate around wage slavery at Burger King, McDonald's, Starbucks or Walmart. Like, much of what Nick Fuentes says in the Tucker Carlson interview in particular, isn't controversial. No pun intended, but he's on the money about the cognitive dissonance in the MAGA base about Israel. And what he says in that interview about the social condition of men in the West at the moment is mostly right as well. What he says about porn and marijuana is right. And what he says about modern women when he isn't cosplaying as an incel is mostly right. I mean, my own experience testifies to that last one, I'm afraid to say. But to refer back to Cole's video, Cole's also right to say that Nick Fuentes is entertaining. Fuentes is funny at times. I have a dark sense of humour, so I can appreciate the odd wild joke here and there, for as long as it is actually funny. And he is no doubt charismatic and a skilled communicator. I can certainly see why young and disaffected American Gen Z conservatives gravitate towards him as much as they do. He's as far cut from the Washington establishment cloth as it's possible to be, more so than Donald Trump. His story of being harassed at university because of his pro-Trump beliefs at an earlier time and being on the receiving end of aggressive gatekeeping, and he was just trying to make a living as a small journalist. Many conservatives had their own version of that story, including me, although I'm not really a conservative. However, this is where I stop agreeing with Cole completely. Because it isn't a virtue to be entertaining, it isn't a virtue to be funny, and it isn't a virtue to be an effective communicator. These things are just skills that can be used for better or for worse, for virtuous and unvirtuous things. For example, Adolf Hitler was quite clearly a skilled communicator. Joseph Stalin was a skilled communicator and effective dictator, as were in fact Saddam Hussein, Pol Pot and Nicolae Ceausescu. In fact, if you were to make a case for the most skilled communicator in modern history, you could make a compelling one for Joseph Goebbels, for socially engineering the conditions for the Nazi Party to centralise and consummate power like it did. Goebbels literally oversaw a department of propaganda within the state apparatus, because positing social outliers as the embodiment of negativity was identified as a practical means by which Germany could be politically and spiritually. It's a practical means by which Germany could practically and spiritually, politically as well, unify its people, ultimately. The fact that something so openly malevolent works is what makes the events that followed among the most tragic in modern history, and why there is such a concerted effort to ensure that nothing of its kind ever transpires again. The point is, the most authoritarian dictators and psychopaths are often charismatic, skilled communicators, and while communicating effectively may be a necessary condition to be a competent national leader, being a charismatic communicator is quite clearly not a virtue on its own. Virtues denote a high standard of morality. Honesty is a virtue, courage is a virtue, empathy is a virtue. Being a good statesman and propagandist, however, is not a virtue, and I don't think I'm alone in saying that Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Saddam Hussein, Pol Pot and Nicolae Ceausescu are not virtuous individuals. Needless to say, being entertaining and funny aren't virtues either, especially when the jokes themselves serve an intentionally propagandistic function, as is the case with Nicholas Fuentes. That said, what worries me the most about this growing enthusiasm for an America First style of politics is not actually its basis on idolatry, personality cults, the transparent virtue signalling in the direction of Nazi apologia, or the rage porn that the very online audience feeds on, as horrendous as all of those things are. Now, the thing that worries me is the performative sleepwalking, and I've noticed this a lot on X recently, into accepting as an alternative to the current post-war consensus a completely irrationalistic and isolationist philosophy that would involve every nation only caring about itself and who it recognises as its people. With this point, I have in mind certain individuals in the Restore Britain camp who seem to be weirdly turned on by Nick Fuentes' dark energy. Now, the immediate response I would expect to get to my virtual interlocutors, you could say, is, well, why shouldn't nation-states only care about themselves and their recognised peoples? Isn't that what nation-states are literally for? Well, to that I'd say there's an important difference to be made between prioritising your nation's interests as a policy, which I agree is a functional prerogative for nation-states, and committing to the view that your nation's interests are the only ones that matter. The phrase America First, funny enough, invokes the first definition, not the second, but I'll put that aside for now. Saying your interests are the only ones that matter, and making that idea the guiding principle of your country's foreign policy is absolutely fine until you find yourself being confronted by a rogue satanic nonce-state of the kind that the dissident right thinkers seem to think actually exists. Especially when it happens to be later down the line a superior military power to you, and nobody comes to your rescue because there's nothing like NATO, and you've completely dismantled all the recognised international prerogatives that were established to prevent such an event from happening in the first place. Practically speaking, and I'm appealing to practical reason here, if you know what that is, national security on any level, including the right to preserve communities and traditions, practically requires a framework of international cooperation, no matter how minimal, in order to prevent an evil military superpower or a rogue state of any kind from turning up and displacing a legitimate population by force. Whatever the grounds of that legitimacy is, in your view. I mean, quite clearly, it's desirable to prevent that from happening. The post-war consensus I readily accept has in many ways dramatically failed to do what it was designed to. Some have even gone as far as saying that it wasn't designed to preserve traditions and cultures in the first place, but I don't agree with that. The universal asset argument that you often hear about why liberal democracies are intrinsically subversive is persuasive because of the extent to which the post-war consensus has failed to preserve traditions and cultures in service of this atomistic idea of individual freedom. However, there's also something else that's not being considered here. Because the alternative that's being proposed by these people, it seems, Fuentes' Groypers, is an international order where only brute force has geopolitical purchase. Like, that's just another form of universal asset. Why? Because like the observations made about classical liberalism, it fails to guarantee the security of the nations themselves and subsequently their traditions. Like, the only thing that it preserves, in fact, are the political facts about power at the time. Like, it's not a serious alternative. And as such, only terminally online or dishonest people would propose it. Fuentes and his folk, I'm afraid to say, do appear to be such people, either terminally online, petulant, or cynically trying to work towards something else. Like, maybe they're accelerationists, which I suspect is to be the case, given the very obvious lack of effort to separate certain critiques of Israel, which are perfectly legitimate, from unfalsifiable conspiracy theories related to international Jewish domination that have persisted for almost 1,000 years and which are all enshrined in this text, this piece of black propaganda called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. But anyway, look, I've never been, and I'm just going to say this, again, as I've said this multiple times before, not here but elsewhere, I've never been the Daily Wire's biggest fan. I've never liked the quality of its coverage. In fact, I ardently disliked it long before this edgelord culture on the right deemed it fashionable to dislike it. But this hill that Fuentes and his Groypers are hell-bent on dying on, these people could do with an introductory lesson on how modern diplomacy actually works. And I say this, by saying this, I'm trying to reach people who are genuinely interested in changing things for the better for Western nations, whether you regard them or want a democracy or not. I mean, you should to some extent. I mean, no one wants a complete autocracy, but anyway. Actually, some might. Actually, no, some definitely do. Anyway, I'm digressing. Turning our back on the world as it exists today, completely, as in making a political effort to do that, completely involves ceasing to look at it geopolitically, as in what it actually is. And that's stupid. Because in the world as it exists today, with China and Russia exercising maximalist intentions, it would be an act of suicide, whether you like it or not. Like, because of technology and other economics and other things, the world is more connected than it's ever been. In many ways, there's no going back. So we have to pragmatically work out how we're going to work with it. And that there are ways of doing that, but you need to seriously commit to a project here. But that doesn't mean we commit to the sacking off of traditions and cultures in the service of advancing in like an atomistic liberalism or technology for its own sake, despite the fact that both does indeed pose to traditions and cultures. It just means that because of the geopolitical landscape, withdrawing from the obvious, from the outside world, and repealing from the strategic alliances that don't offer an immediately obvious benefit, is going to have consequences now in ways that we previously would not have had at all. Like, let's just presuppose, for example, purely for the sake of argument, with the same argument that Fuentes' Groypers and the lunatic faction of the dissident right make, that Israel is the amoral, psychopathic, Machiavellian state that they want to think it is. What will actually happen, and this is a kind of a thought experiment here, what will actually happen, do you think, if the West collectively does decide to stop supporting it after deciding, just judging that it's no longer strategically advantageous for it to support it politically, militarily, etc.? What happens then, do you think? I can actually hear the certain polemicists now saying, oh, we'll finally be able to look after ourselves and offer subsidies for white families to have more children, we can build more churches and everything will be brilliant. Well, look, that could be true in the short term. But because of the endemic problems that Israel has over territory, wherever you stand on the issue, Israel is not in a position to think twice about building tighter partnerships with those who can offer it, namely Russia and China, if it provides them with the strategic security that it wants in the region. And Russia and China, I think more obviously still, are not going to ground their maximalism to a halt just because the West does, and anyone who suggests that it would is either Jeremy Corbyn or doesn't understand the slightest thing about either regime, let alone the role of emergent imperial powers such as India and Turkey, whose modus operandi is fence-sitting until the obvious winner emerges. Abandoning every alliance because you hate the Israel lobby is not a serious form of political thinking. It leaves the West blind, while China and Russia keep building their empires, ultimately, whatever that looks like to you. That's not America first, that's America alone, and America alone is going to end up being eaten by those much larger and hungrier bears. So if you're serious about having an America for Americans or having a Britain for Britons, you need to think with reference to a bigger picture than the one that you currently are. I mean, the absolute fury that we saw, for example, with Operation Midnight Hammer, as in the aftermath, not before it took place, and how this has served as the turning point against MAGA Fuentes, just shows how myopic his political analysis is. It may well be the case that the amount that America benefits strategically from its partnership with Israel at present is overstated, maybe. But there is absolutely no denying that Iran poses an existential threat to the entire West. A rogue Islamic state with nuclear weapons is quite literally a bomb waiting to go off. So the destruction of nuclear facilities, assuming that the operation was somewhat successful, conceivably at least did the West a favour in some regard, even if the operation only went as far as setting the nuclear programme back. To say that this was entirely in the interests of Israel is not true, I'm afraid to say. It might be in the immediate interest of Israel, but quite clearly it's not an exclusive problem to Israel, and Israel and Iran most certainly does not cease to be a problem if, in the worst case scenario, Israel falls as a nation. So again, just think better. Technical issues here. But anyway. Look, I was among those who believed that the operation may ignite World War III. I was genuinely very worried, but it didn't, and I'm delighted that it didn't. And the fact that it didn't, shows, I like to think, the quality of the intelligence that you get when you have proxies in the Middle East willing to share accurate information with you. So, again, that's unfortunately another point to the so-called neocons, if you like, as much as I'm not a neocon. The point is, Fuentes and his cult doesn't consider any of this, and that's what worries me. But at the same time, I'm going to start wrapping up, I suspect that they want to think seriously. Because despite all of Fuentes' attempts to make himself reasonable and measured in that interview with Tucker Carlson, it's clear to me that he's pandering to an audience that is composed of Nazi sympathisers. I'm sorry, but it's easier just to call a spade a spade. And I just wish that people like Tim Pool would be a little bit smarter or a bit more honest, when they engage with this subject. One of the responses I saw circulating from Tim Pool's circle summarised pretty much how stupid some... I'm not including Cole in this, by the way. I think Cole has been a lot more nuanced in his interpretation of this. Tim Pool has... I heard a statement by Tim Pool circulating around where he's basically saying, what has Fuentes actually said that is so bad or Nazi adjacent? That's a paraphrase, that's not a direct quote. But to that, I'd like to issue the following response. Don't be an idiot, Tim. Seriously, don't be an idiot. Or more accurately, don't be a liar. Because we all know it's not what Fuentes explicitly says that is the problem. It's problematic, but it isn't a part of the problem that the majority of us, I like to think, intellectually honest people want to own in on anyway. It's what he doesn't say, actually, that's the problem. It's the details that he conveniently omits when he makes, for example, jokes about cookies and ovens. Like, he knows perfectly well just what his certain occultist audience wants to hear, and he knows perfectly well what metaphysics they subscribe to and who they posit as like the metaphysical like other that somehow deserves permanent incarceration. And you can't just say things like that and then say, "Oh, only kidding," every time and think that you've got away scot-free. Like, it wears thin after a while. Until I see Nick Fuentes conduct a proper historical critique of the canards that he repeatedly invokes, namely about a global Zionist cabal, for example, I'm not going to consider him as anything else other than a talented rage porn merchant that, like several others in this space, seem to thrive off the retarded neuroticism of their own audience. Sorry that this video came across as a bit disorganised. It wasn't meant to be well organised, but yeah, just leave a comment if you have anything that you want to add or want to call me out on anything that I'm wrong about. I'll do my best to respond.